The desert does not forgive. It does not care. It watches and it waits. And sometimes men vanish into it, not because of bandits, not because of Apaches, not because of the rattlesnakes or the heat, but because the desert itself lends its silence to darker predators. In 1875, Arizona was not yet a state, just a territory stitched together by fear and greed, an unforgiving expanse where lawmen were few, graves were shallow, and the only true power came from those who understood how to control fear. Out here, a man could lose his fortune, his life, and even his name, and no one would ever ask what became of him. But there was one place, one building, that became the whispered threshold between survival and disappearance: a saloon. You've heard stories of saloons before: rowdy laughter, whiskey-soaked poker games, tired men with dust on their boots and hunger in their throats. But this one was different. Men who walked through its doors did not always walk back out. They were swallowed by charm, by shadows, by two women who understood how to make death feel like a velvet invitation. These were not the painted dance girls or the tragic widows that dime novels romanticize. No, these were predators, sisters who moved through smoke and piano music like vipers through tall grass. They didn't need guns. They didn't need to shout. They had something far more dangerous: patience, calculation, and the knowledge that men are easiest to destroy when they believe they are desired. The settlement where it stood is nearly forgotten now, a husk on the maps, a ghost on the trails. But in 1875, travelers knew its name: Bumblebee Creek, and at its edge stood the Copper Queen Saloon, lit with polished glass and warm laughter, promising comfort in a land that offered none. To the weary traveler, it looked like salvation. To the doomed, it was a trap disguised as home. Ask yourself this: what kind of women arrive out of nowhere, build an empire overnight, and never answer the simplest questions of where they came from? In a territory where everyone's past was an open wound, how did these sisters remain untouchable? You're about to hear a story buried in archives, stripped from headlines, whispered only in the drunken recollections of dying men. A story the frontier itself conspired to forget. And once you know what happened inside those walls, you will never look at a saloon girl the same way again. They called themselves Margaret and Elizabeth Mackenzie, but those names were nothing more than masks, borrowed identities that could never be traced to any Missouri census or family Bible, and yet no one dared to question them when they appeared in Bumblebee Creek with enough gold to purchase a 2-story establishment outright, a sum no unaccompanied women of the era should have possessed. The locals whispered they must have inherited it. Others muttered they must have stolen it. But the truth, as always in the frontier, was more sinister. Their wealth was not what they carried in, but what they would siphon out of the men who came to them, men drawn by the copper trails, the silver veins, and the endless promise of riches buried in the desert hills. And while these prospectors and investors believed they were masters of their own fate, the sisters had already mastered the game long before, understanding that men are weakest, not when they are drunk, not when they are tired, but when they are seen. When a woman looks at them as though every scar and failure has been forgiven, when she leans close in the haze of lamplight and says his name softly, as if it mattered. Margaret was the fire, her auburn hair gleaming, her words sharp and captivating, her laughter a lure that made men forget the loaded pistols at their hips. Elizabeth was the shadow, her eyes quiet and unblinking, her silence unsettling, her movements so soft that even the floorboards seemed unwilling to betray her presence. Together they crafted an illusion of refinement, a saloon that pretended to be more than a saloon, with polished floors, strict rules, fine meals, and an atmosphere that promised safety. Yet it was precisely this illusion of safety that made their chosen prey lower their guard, for only men of means were guided upstairs to the premium rooms tucked into the far end of the building, where the Saloon's walls pressed against the hillside, and it was here that the trail of every missing man ended, their names scratched from history as efficiently as chalk wiped from a slate. In a land where justice was nothing more than a marshal and 2 deputies patrolling a territory the size of a nation, disappearances were swallowed whole by silence. And the locals, well, the locals said nothing, because in Arizona of 1875, to ask questions was to invite the same fate as the men who never walked back out of the Copper Queen's doors. By the time the Copper Queen had been operating for a single year, whispers were already spreading among the freighters and miners who passed through Bumblebee Creek that the place had a strange gravity, that men with too much money in their saddlebags or too much gold in their pockets never seemed to make it past Prescott if they stopped at the saloon first. And though the official records insisted these men must have simply lost their way to Mexico or abandoned their families in search of fortune elsewhere, the ledger of reality told a different story, one written in abandoned luggage, unanswered letters, and wives who never saw their husbands again. And yet, what is most unsettling is not that the disappearances happened, but that they were allowed to happen, because when Margaret smiled across a table at a visiting investor, when Elizabeth silently poured a glass of whiskey for a man who thought himself clever, every other pair of eyes in the room looked away, and the silence of the community became the true accomplice. Those who lived near the Queen began to notice strange things: a saw purchased at midnight, coal oil bought in excessive amounts, stains hidden beneath gloves, the faint sound of hammering behind closed shutters when most of the town slept. And yet nothing was ever reported, because men who had already made peace with lawlessness understood that certain doors were not meant to be opened, and certain neighbors not to be questioned. What's important to understand is that the sisters' operation was not frantic, not reckless, but terrifyingly deliberate. They knew the rhythms of travel, the weight of coin purses, the loneliness of men who wanted to be remembered, and they exploited those vulnerabilities with surgical precision, selecting victims not at random, but with the cold eye of predators, choosing only the fattest cattle from the herd. It was said that Margaret had a memory sharper than any ledger, that she could recall a man's business holdings, his family details, even the names of his children from a single night's conversation. And while he thought himself flattered, thought himself safe in the attention of a refined woman, she was already calculating the moment his wealth would pass into her hands and his body into the earth. And Elizabeth, she was the executioner, the one who moved through shadowed hallways like an unspoken threat, the one who carried out what Margaret only promised, and together they turned the Copper Queen into more than a saloon, more than a boarding house. It became a machine of disappearance, an engine that devoured men and spit nothing back but silence, leaving the desert itself as their only witness. What gave the Copper Queen its most insidious power was not the murders themselves, but the way they were hidden in plain sight. For the building was not just a saloon, but a carefully engineered labyrinth, altered from its original design the moment the sisters took possession of it. Its walls thickened, its cellar deepened into the hillside, and its premium rooms at the far end of the second floor lined with false partitions that concealed doors leading directly into the earth, where passageways allowed bodies to be dragged into the desert without ever crossing the front door again. And this was no improvisation. It was a plan, a blueprint executed with precision, as if the sisters had studied the art of vanishing before ever stepping foot in Arizona. Witnesses later remembered how carpenters were paid in cash to reinforce floors that had no reason to be reinforced, how false backs were built into wardrobes and closets sealed with hidden latches, but none of the men who worked on those renovations asked why, for cash silenced their curiosity and fear kept their mouths closed long after the work was finished. And so, when travelers of means came to the Copper Queen, men who carried gold drafts, legal papers, or simply a reputation worth killing for, they were placed in those special rooms where Elizabeth's quiet footsteps echoed softly against the walls, and Margaret's laughter floated up the staircase like the call of a siren, until eventually the men were gone, erased as if they had never arrived. Even lawmen, when asked by desperate wives who traced their husbands' last letters to Bumblebee Creek, shrugged the cases off with official language about men wandering south or being lost to Apache raids, never daring to press too far. For everyone in the territory knew that pushing too hard against the sisters' establishment was an invitation to disappear yourself. The Copper Queen became a paradox, both the most respectable house in the region and the most feared, a place where weary travelers longed to rest, but locals passed quickly, eyes forward, unwilling to meet Margaret's gaze, because to be noticed by her was to be marked, and the desert has a long memory for those who vanish without graves. The first true wave of unease came not from the sudden vanishing of one man, but from the slow accumulation of whispers, for in the span of only 2 years more than a dozen well-dressed travelers rode into Bumblebee Creek and never rode out again, their names appearing in ledgers at the Copper Queen, their horses stabled and their belongings noted, yet their final steps erased with surgical precision, leaving behind no corpse, no witness, only silence that pressed against the walls like a suffocating fog. And though the desert was always eager to swallow men, bandits, thirst, Apache raids, this pattern was different, too neat, too clean, as if something intelligent was orchestrating the vanishings from within the very heart of the town. It was Elizabeth's hand that inked every guest's name with perfect calligraphy, her ledger neat and tidy, an artifact that became more chilling the longer one studied it, for the last entry beside each missing man was always flawless, as though mocking the permanence of ink against the impermanence of flesh, while Margaret's role was harder to define, her laughter and warmth pulling strangers into comfort, disarming them with charm, until the hour grew late and their candle burned low upstairs, where secret doors waited behind plaster and brick. Those who dared whisper too loudly found themselves silenced. One blacksmith's apprentice who claimed to have seen a man drag through the back cellar door was discovered days later, with his face crushed under a fallen beam in his father's forge. Another miner, who swore he heard screams beneath the floorboards of the Copper Queen, was found at dawn with his head floating in a water trough, his body never recovered. In time, people stopped asking where the missing men had gone, for fear was a tighter gag than rope and a sharper blade than steel, and the sisters walked the street each Sunday in their white dresses, untouched, untouchable, smiling as if the town itself had bent to their will, as if Bumblebee Creek no longer belonged to the miners or ranchers, but to them, the keepers of an inn that had become less a place of rest than a mouth that swallowed without chewing, a mouth the desert itself seemed to hunger through. The unease that had for so long been contained within the dusty streets of Bumblebee Creek eventually seeped beyond its borders, for families of the vanished sent letters, handwritten pleas scrawled on brittle paper, to sheriffs, judges, even to the Pinkerton Detective Agency itself, and though most were ignored, dismissed as the risks of frontier travel, one dossier found its way into the hands of a man named Elias Rourke, a Pinkerton with a reputation for sniffing rot beneath polished floorboards, and he arrived in town not with bluster or a star pinned to his chest, but with silence, lodging at the Copper Queen under a false name, his eyes sharp, his questions casual yet cutting, like knives hidden in linen. The sisters welcomed him, as they welcomed all men, with charm so honeyed it might have drowned lesser suspicions. But Rourke was not easily softened, and he took note of the way Elizabeth never flinched when asked about those who had stayed before, how her fingers tapped the ledger as though guarding it, how Margaret's laughter sometimes rang too loudly in empty rooms, as if to drown something out beneath the floorboards. Yet even he could not pierce their mask at once, for the Copper Queen had been built not just as a lodging house, but as a labyrinth, its walls concealing passageways so narrow only one body could pass at a time, its cellar dug deep into the bones of the earth, shored up with timbers blackened by fire and marked with strange carvings whose origin no miner in town could explain. Some nights Rourke swore he heard movement, soft dragging like sacks across stone, when every guest was asleep and the lamps were dark, and once in the moonlight he thought he saw Margaret leading a figure, half naked and stumbling, toward the stable door, though when he descended at dawn the stalls were empty and the ground raked smooth as if scrubbed clean. But Rourke Mall, a fatal mistake, for he lingered too long, and in Bumblebee Creek those who lingered became part of the town's silence, and though he sent one letter northward, half a report sealed in wax and meant for the agency, it never reached its mark, the rider carrying it vanishing on the trail as if swallowed by the same hunger that gnawed nightly at the Copper Queen, leaving behind no proof but whispers, and a growing dread that the sisters' power was not only unchecked but shielded by something far older than law. The townsfolk of Bumblebee Creek, though they lived within spitting distance of the Copper Queen and watched the sisters' shadows pass nightly behind their lace curtains, chose silence over truth. For silence was easier, safer, and demanded no courage. And so, when questions rose, why the butcher's boy never returned from delivering meat, why the widow from Tucson vanished after boarding a room, why children whispered of screams they swore they heard in the small hours, the answers were smothered beneath the heavy quilt of denial, and mothers hushed their children, fathers stiffened their jaws, and ministers spoke of temptation, but never named its source. The saloon men, who had seen miners drained of coin and spirit by the sisters' gentle hands, shrugged that such was the price of beauty, while the storekeepers, who profited from the women's endless purchasing of salt, lye, and thick rope, kept their tongues bitten bloody. Even the sheriff, whose badge was more ornamental than functional, avoided the Copper Queen's porch as if its very wood bore contagion, and in his ledger, beside the long list of missing men and women, he scribbled the same word over and over, departed, never daring to write taken. For the truth was that Bumblebee Creek had made a bargain, not in writing but in fear, and the bargain was simple. Better that strangers vanish than the town itself be marked for ruin. Better to avert one's gaze and pray the hunger never turned inward. But in such bargains corruption festers, and soon there were whispers that the land itself had soured, that cattle sickened when driven too near the Copper Queen, that wells ran brackish in its shadow, that children born in town after 1889 carried a mark behind their left ear like a bruise that never faded, and yet still the townsfolk bowed their heads when Elizabeth and Margaret walked by, still tipped their hats, still sent gifts of eggs, milk, and pies to the boarding house as though appeasing some wrathful deity with offerings. For beneath the surface all knew one thing. If the sisters could keep strangers silent, they could just as easily silence their neighbors, and thus the entire town, willingly or not, became complicit in the nightmare, a cocoon of fear woven tight around the Copper Queen, until the difference between victim and accomplice blurred, and Bumblebee Creek itself became a kind of accomplice, living, breathing, guilty. It was the autumn of 1891 when the first undeniable fracture split the hush that Bumblebee Creek had worn like a second skin, for on a moonless night the church bell tolled not by human hand but by something unseen, and when the townsfolk stumbled half-dressed into the square, they found the bell rope slick with blood and a trail of footprints, bare, small, almost childlike, leading not to the chapel, but toward the Copper Queen, vanishing at its porch, as though swallowed by the threshold. And though every man present clenched his fists, and every woman clutched her shawl tighter, not a soul dared cross that porch line, not even the sheriff, who muttered that coyotes had dragged some animal carcass through town, though no one had ever seen a coyote ring a bell or leave prints shaped like a child's foot. The following morning, when Mrs. Kendall's boy Thomas failed to return from his errand at the butcher's, the town gathered again, and though the mother screamed herself hoarse that her son had been taken, the men told her he had simply wandered into the hills, perhaps fallen into a ravine, perhaps lost his way. But the truth sat thick and sour in every throat. The boy's trail had led straight to the Copper Queen, same as the bell's bloody footprints, and when Margaret herself appeared at the porch in her nightgown, hair loose like a widow's veil, she simply smiled and asked if she might help search. Her voice, sweet as honey poured on stone, and the men of Bumblebee Creek, who had rifles in their hands, pistols at their hips, lowered their weapons as though enchanted and let her words bind them tighter than chains. That night, The mother of Thomas Kendall was escorted back to her house, her screams muffled by hymns sung too loudly in the church, as though voices raised in prayer could drown the truth. But in the weeks that followed, the town discovered another mark upon itself. The children began waking with blood at their ears, muttering strange phrases in their sleep, words no preacher could translate, and when asked, they said a woman whispered to them from the dark corners of their rooms, promising that they, too, would be chosen soon. Yet still the townsfolk kept their silence, though now it was not the silence of denial, but the silence of terror. For to name the sisters' hunger aloud was to invite it, and so Bumblebee Creek endured, its nights heavier, its days slower, its every soul watching the Copper Queen as one might watch the gallows being built plank by plank. Yet the truest measure of their darkness was not in the number of bodies that fed the desert, but in the way they reshaped the very air of Bumblebee Creek, for the town itself seemed to bend around the Copper Queen, its streets leading inevitably toward its glowing windows no matter how much locals tried to avoid it, and men spoke in hushed tones of an invisible pull, a gravity of dread, as if the sisters had carved their names into the soil itself. The building became more than brick and timber. It was a living organism, its walls sweating when the lamps were extinguished, its doors sighing in the wind like lungs drawing breath. And in that oppressive atmosphere the miners who still dared to drink there felt their strength dissolve, their hands trembling against their mugs as Elizabeth watched in silence from her shadowed corner. It was said that dogs refused to cross the saloon's threshold, that horses spooked when tethered near the hitching posts, and that children, whose eyes had not yet learned to blind themselves with reason, cried simply at the sight of the Copper Queen looming in the moonlight, like a predator at rest. Even the desert seemed to conspire in their concealment. Sandstorms rose on nights when screams might have carried, coyotes circled the outskirts as if guarding a secret, and the riverbed itself shifted its course just enough to swallow what little evidence might have been left behind. In this atmosphere of silence and complicity, Bumblebee Creek became not a town, but a stage, a place where the sisters' theater of death could play endlessly without interruption, and the people, though they felt the weight of their fear, found ways to convince themselves that nothing unusual was happening, that men drifted, that fortunes changed, that sometimes people simply vanished into the west. But behind that denial pulsed the truth everyone sensed but dared not name, that the Copper Queen was less a saloon than a shrine to appetite, and the sisters its high priestesses, officiating rituals of disappearance so flawless that to even whisper about them was to court annihilation. But inevitability has a way of gnawing through even the strongest facades, and the Copper Queen, though draped in shadows and silence, began to betray hairline fractures in its mask for men who left its doors. Those few lucky enough to stagger out alive were not the same as when they entered, their eyes hollow, their faces pale as parchment, as if the very marrow had been drawn from their bones. Wives whispered of husbands returning home without memory of the night, their hands shaking uncontrollably, their skin carrying faint bruises in the shapes of fingers that were not theirs. And though these men never spoke of what they saw inside, their silence screamed louder than confession. Rumors sprouted like weeds. A miner found wandering barefoot in the desert miles away, muttering about dancing in the cellar with corpses. A ranch hand who swore he saw Elizabeth carrying a sack that dripped dark liquid into the sand. A preacher who stumbled into Sunday service raving that the Queen's piano played itself long after closing, the melody soaked in grief too heavy for human hands. And then there was the night when a rider passing by swore he saw the windows lit blood-red from within, as if the sisters were baptizing the walls with something more than wine. The glow so unnatural it clung to his eyes for days, like a brand he could not wash away. Slowly, reluctantly, the townsfolk began to acknowledge what had been clawing at the edges of their awareness all along, that the Copper Queen was no mere saloon, no den of drunken excess, but a vortex where life went in and did not return, a machine grinding bone into dust beneath the hum of laughter and piano keys. Yet even as fear congealed into certainty, no one dared name the sisters aloud, for to accuse them was to invite their gaze, and in Bumblebee Creek there was nothing more final, nothing more damning, than being noticed by Elizabeth or Catherine Caraway. It was only a matter of time before the unease at Bumblebee Creek spilled beyond its dusty borders, for fear has a way of traveling faster than horses, and whispers of the Copper Queen began reaching the ears of men who made their trade in chasing shadows. Wandering marshals, fortune-seekers, bounty hunters, even a priest or two who believed hell sometimes wore human skin. And it was a figure of this sort, a lawman named Jonas Kittrell, who first rode into town under the weight of these rumors, his badge dulled, his coat frayed, his eyes carrying that cold resolve men acquire only after staring too long into graves. And though he claimed to come in pursuit of an outlaw last seen near the mining camps, the townsfolk knew the truth. He had come for the Queen, or rather, for the stories that bled from its walls. The sisters, of course, welcomed him with a smile, for men like Jonas were merely meat with questions, and questions had a way of feeding their hunger as much as blood ever did. He was seen entering the saloon one night, nodding politely to Catherine as Elizabeth offered him a drink, his broad shoulders cutting through the smoke and laughter like a blade. But what unsettled the crowd was not that he entered. It was that the sisters seemed to know him before a word was spoken, their eyes meeting his with recognition so sharp it left those watching with the sense that Jonas Kittrell had not arrived in Bumblebee Creek by accident, but by design. For 3 nights he was seen in their company, his face growing more pallid with each passing evening, his hand twitching toward the pistol at his hip as though something inside him begged for violence. But on the 4th morning his horse was found grazing outside town without a rider, his saddle empty, his rifle still strapped tight, and when a miner swore he glimpsed Kittrell's hat snagged on a branch behind the Copper Queen. Soaked through as if dipped in a trough of blood, the sheriff muttered that perhaps the lawman had simply gone on his way. But no one believed it, and though his name was never spoken again in the saloon, the silence around it confirmed what everyone already suspected. Jonas Kittrell hadn't been the first man to walk willingly into the jaws of the Queen, and he certainly would not be the last. After Jonas Kittrell's vanishing, Bumblebee Creek grew quieter than a graveyard at midnight, for though the miners still swung their picks and the saloon still spilled whiskey, there lingered an unspoken agreement among the townsfolk to avoid looking too long at the Copper Queen or the sisters who ruled it, as if acknowledgment itself might invite ruin. Men began to cross the street rather than walk before its crimson door. Women tugged their children indoors when Catherine's laughter drifted down the road, and even the sheriff, once boastful about keeping order, was seen riding the long way around town so he would not have to pass by its brooding facade. Yet the Queen thrived in silence, for its reputation carried across the territories like wildfire, drawing gamblers, drifters, and those who mistook whispers of horror for invitation. And it was in these outsiders that the sisters found endless sustenance. Every month or so a stranger would arrive, often asking in low tones about Jonas Kittrell or about the gold that supposedly flowed freer in Bumblebee than any other town, and each time the same pattern repeated. The man would be seen at the bar, Elizabeth leaning close with her dark eyes fixed upon him, Catherine brushing his arm with a hand that seemed to burn cold rather than warm, and then, days later, the stranger would be gone without a farewell, his boots left under a chair, his coin purse emptied, his face never spoken of again. What truly unnerved the locals was not the loss of life, for death was as common as dust in the frontier, but the sense that the Copper Queen was no longer merely a place of indulgence. It was a maw, an organism that fed and grew, its red lanterns glowing brighter with each soul it devoured, as though it consumed more than flesh, and the sisters, untouched by age or fatigue, became spectral presences in their own right, drifting through town, only at dusk, their shadows long and unnatural against the dirt road, their beauty unchanged while the rest of the settlement grew weary, scarred, and bent with labor. The Queen had become less a building than a boundary, a line that divided the ordinary world from something darker, and Bumblebee Creek, whether out of cowardice, survival, or secret complicity, chose to keep the line intact, treating the place as one might treat a cursed well. Never drink, never peer inside, never speak too loudly of the water that waits in the dark. But avoidance was never protection, for soon the Copper Queen's reach extended beyond her painted walls, seeping into the marrow of Bumblebee Creek like a sickness carried on the wind, and those who had never stepped foot inside began to feel its pull. Mothers woke shrieking in the night, claiming they had heard Catherine's laughter at their bedside. Men reported waking to find their dreams stained with images of red halls and mirrored rooms that seemed to breathe, and children, who had once been the keenest at sensing danger, now grew pale and withdrawn, sketching pictures in the dirt of a tall, faceless woman with hair like dripping ink. Horses shied violently when led past the Queen, as if smelling a predator crouched just out of sight, and the well water nearest the brothel turned brackish, coating the buckets with a coppery residue that made men gag, though the sisters drank freely from their own cups and never suffered for it. The town physician, a man of science and superstition both, remarked that the place was warping not just minds but matter, for his instruments, simple as they were, never read steady near its walls. Compasses spun in circles, lamps flickered low though oil was fresh, and even iron nails left on the bar seemed to corrode overnight, as though time itself bent differently under that roof. Yet when he raised these observations in a trembling voice at the saloon, no one dared answer him, for to acknowledge the Queen's power was to invite it nearer, and so the town chose silence, pretending the creeping dread was nothing but bad whiskey or the weight of the mines. Still, a truth pressed against their denial. Every man who vanished seemed not only forgotten, but erased, his name dissolving from memory as though the town itself colluded in his disappearance. And even those who tried to recall Jonas Kittrell's face found it slipping away, replaced by the Saubai, a painted smile of Elizabeth, or the pale, lingering gaze of Catherine. Thus the Copper Queen ceased to be merely a place of indulgence or fear. It became the silent heartbeat of Bumblebee Creek, a force that rewrote memory, bent reality, and whispered in the marrow of every man, woman, and child that its hunger was endless and its reach unbound. It was inevitable that word of the Copper Queen drifted beyond Bumblebee Creek, carried not by letters or official reports. Those seemed to vanish, as though the post refused to bear such cargo, but by whispers in the mouths of drifters who passed through, each retelling making the story more irresistible to the curious and the damned alike. Until one autumn morning, a preacher arrived from Prescott, drawn not by invitation, but by what he claimed was a dream of a black house with windows that watched, a house that called him by name. And though the townsfolk begged him to leave before he met the same end as the others, he pressed forward, declaring that no den of harlots or demons could withstand the word. Yet when he stepped through the Queen's red door, carrying only a weather-beaten Bible and his own trembling faith, no one saw him emerge again, though that very night a hymn none of the town's churchgoers recognized drifted through the air, sung in a dozen voices at once, low and mournful, like a dirge for the living. Weeks later, a newspaper man from Denver came, sharp-eyed and eager to carve a story out of the desert, and though he asked clever questions in the saloon, the locals only answered with shrugs and stares at their glasses. But when he insisted on seeing the Queen for himself, sketchpad and pencil ready, the last they saw of him was his shadow merging with the longer, darker shadow that stretched from the brothel at dusk, and in the morning his notebook was found torn to pieces outside the mine shaft, the fragments still legible enough to read his last line, "She knew my mother's name." After that, even the law, slow and reluctant as it was, stirred. A deputy rode in from Bisbee, tall and stone-faced, announcing he'd been sent to put an end to the rumors. But before he could even unsaddle his horse, the animal bolted, wild-eyed, into the desert night, And the deputy himself, though he stood calm before the queen, was found the next dawn sitting upright against a fence post, eyes open, lips moving silently, whispering something no one dared lean close enough to hear. Outsiders came, and outsiders were taken, until even the wandering drifters gave Bumblebee Creek a wide berth, and the queen, instead of shrinking under scrutiny, seemed to swell, her influence spreading, her voice carried on the wind so that strangers dreamed of her without ever stepping foot in town, as if she were no longer confined to timber and paint, but had become an idea, a living curse that needed only to be remembered to grow stronger. And yet the story of Willow Creek does not end with the silence of its ruined cabins and the rotting wood of its abandoned chapel. For silence here has always been an illusion, a veil stretched thin across the face of something older, darker, and immeasurably patient. Those who walk the forest paths today, thinking themselves bold in daylight, have reported that their footsteps never sound quite right, as though echoed back by something invisible, pacing them just out of sight. Hunters claim that deer refuse to cross the boundaries of the old settlement, circling wide as if guided by an instinct older than memory, and fishermen who cast their lines into the creek tell of ripples moving against the current, as though something beneath is rising rather than drifting. The air itself carries the weight of what was done here, the prayers mumbled too late, the bargains whispered into the dirt, the families who vanished without graves to mark their passing. And this is the truth no historian dares admit. Willow Creek is not just a place where lives were lost. It is a place where time was broken, a scar left open in the fabric of what should be. Every attempt to erase its memory, every effort to fence it off or pave over its history has failed because what was bound here does not lie still. It seeps, it whispers, it waits. The town may have burned, its records may have rotted, but its shadow stretches forward into every generation that follows, catching the curious, the reckless, the arrogant, who think they can stare into the abyss without the abyss staring back. Willow Creek is no mere ruin. It is a wound that never heals, a reminder that some stories do not belong to the past, but to the present, and to the listener who dares to lean too close. And so the question remains, one that has haunted scholars, wanderers, and the rare few survivors who returned with hollow eyes and trembling hands. What exactly did the founders of Willow Creek awaken? And why does it still linger, undiminished by fire, famine, or time itself? There are whispers that the land had never been theirs to claim, that long before the settlers laid axe to tree and stone to foundation, a covenant had been written in the earth by people who understood the cost of disturbing it, a covenant sealed with silence and fear. Some say the stones the townsfolk unearthed, those black glassy shards that burned cold in the hand, were not natural, but fragments of something buried, something meant never to see the sky again. Others insist the chants heard on the wind were not cries of mourning, but invocations, repeated by desperate voices that no longer remembered their meaning, words meant to bind rather than release. Yet, in every version of the story, one truth stands immutable. Willow Creek was not abandoned because of hunger or plague, nor because of fire or war, but because something had been called, and once called, it did not leave. This is why no map marks it clearly, why no family claims descent from its founders, why the woods themselves grow thicker, darker, and more oppressive the closer one dares to approach its heart. The people who lived there were not erased by accident. They were devoured by design, by an arrangement older than America itself, older perhaps than the land beneath our feet. And if you think this is nothing more than folklore, then ask yourself why the ground still trembles when no wind stirs the trees, why compasses falter near the creek bed, why photographs taken at its edge blur and warp, as though reality itself refuses to be captured. Willow Creek is not a forgotten town. It is a trap, an echo chamber of suffering designed to lure the curious closer, until curiosity itself becomes the final nail in their coffin, because those who have ventured near Willow Creek without knowing its history almost always describe the same progression of events. A strange quiet that falls too suddenly, a weight in the air, as though the woods themselves are holding their breath, the sound of footsteps just beyond sight, though no one is there, and finally, the irresistible pull to step deeper, to look closer, as though the forest is alive and drawing them in with invisible hands. Hunters lose their bearings within minutes, their dogs whimpering before refusing to cross a certain invisible line. Hikers who joke about old ghost stories are later found wandering aimlessly, unable to explain why their memories of the trail fragment into static, broken images that don't line up with reality. And in one of the few documented cases, a surveyor in the 1920s claimed that time itself faltered, that the shadows of the trees bent against the sun's position, that the hands of his watch spun freely as if the gears had slipped loose from the world. He returned pale, incoherent, unable to write more than one sentence before he disappeared entirely. The earth remembers, and it hates us. That single line, preserved in his notes, became the foundation for the government's quiet decision to seal off the area. No signs, no fences, just subtle deterrents, maps that mislead, roads that twist into dead ends, warnings whispered through park rangers who know not to say too much. Yet the curse of Willow Creek is not bound by boundaries or borders. Those who hear its story too often, who obsess over its mystery, sometimes dream of it, waking with mud on their feet, their sheets damp with the smell of pine and river water, as if the place itself is reaching outward, hunting new vessels. What happened there is not finished. It is ongoing, a wound that never healed, a mouth that never closed, and every retelling, every investigation, every new pair of eyes that dares to glimpse its truth is another offering, another sacrifice to keep its hunger alive. And the hunger, once you begin to recognize it, is not random. It has a pattern, a grim arithmetic that scholars and occultists who dared to study Willow Creek have pieced together from scattered fragments of diaries, coroner's reports, and whispered testimony. Every 13 years, give or take a season, the forest takes its tithe. Whole families vanish without trace. Livestock are found mutilated with surgical precision, children are lured from their homes by voices only they can hear, and always there is the same grotesque symbol carved into wood, stone, or flesh. The circle broken by a downward slash, resembling both an eye forced open and a mouth forced shut. Survivors, rare as they are, never remain whole. They speak in half-sentences, lose days at a time, or become violent without provocation, as though something from the creek follows them back, wearing them down from the inside. Priests called it demonic. Scientists called it an anomaly in magnetic fields. Folklorists called it a curse, stitched from generations of blood. But none of them could deny that the pattern is consistent, unyielding, as if the land itself has a memory and a will. And what chills the bone more than anything is that the curse does not merely consume, it transforms. The missing do not rest. Hunters swear they have seen figures in the trees, pale and elongated, their movements disjointed, wrong, like marionettes tugged by unseen strings. Some claim they hear the voices of the lost in the rushing water, pleading, begging, bargaining, while others insist the forest births things that are neither human nor animal, but something in between, grown from the marrow of every body it has claimed. Willow Creek is not just haunted, it is alive, sentient in the most predatory sense, and what it wants is not just blood, but remembrance. For each telling of its legend sharpens its teeth, each whispered warning is another invitation, and every ear that bends to hear its story becomes part of the tally. And so the town of Willow Creek exists in a state of permanent twilight between denial and dread, where the locals wear polite smiles in the daytime but bolt their doors at night, where outsiders who stumble too far into the woods are politely but urgently warned away, and where even law enforcement files go missing when they touch too closely on the patterns. It is as though some unseen archivist keeps redacting history itself, pruning back the truth every time it threatens to bloom in the open. Newspapers that once reported on vanished children suddenly carry blank spaces where their names should be. Families who lost loved ones find that photographs fade faster than they should, and when a rare investigator insists on digging too deep, they either vanish like the rest or re-emerge broken, muttering about eyes in the roots and mouths in the stones. The deeper one peers into Willow Creek's legend, the more it resists being known, as if secrecy is not just its defense, but its sustenance, what it feeds on as much as flesh and blood. And yet, the whispers persist because silence never lasts. Stories leak through cracks in the walls of fear. Travelers recount strange encounters on forgotten backroads, and those marked by the creek carry its shadow with them, no matter how far they flee. Perhaps the greatest horror of all is not that the forest demands sacrifices, or that the missing are transformed, but that knowledge itself is part of the curse, that simply hearing of Willow Creek places you within its reach, another tally in its endless hunger, another thread pulled tight in its unseen web, until one day you realize that it is no longer you who is remembering the story, but the story remembering you. And that is why every generation finds itself drawn back, compelled to retell the story as though it isn't theirs to control, but rather an infection carried forward, a curse transmitted by memory itself, where the act of speaking its name allows the thing buried in the creek's soil to grow stronger, more aware, more precise in the way it selects its prey. It doesn't simply stalk the lost anymore. It engineers them, orchestrating the coincidences that drive people into its domain, arranging chance encounters and whispered dreams until a stranger finds themselves inexplicably compelled to wander too far down a forgotten path. Some say it is the land remembering its own blood, pulling descendants of the first settlers back to pay what their ancestors owed, while others insist it is not the land at all, but something older, something that squatted here long before men ever cut trees or built homes, something that tolerated them only so long as they fed it tribute. The horror lies not only in its appetite, but in the inevitability of its design, because the more you resist the pull, the tighter it coils around you, until resistance itself becomes the very path to ruin. That is why Willow Creek is never truly abandoned, why homes stand empty yet never collapse, why fires die down but never consume, why the woods reclaim everything but never fully erase it. Because this place does not want erasure, it wants permanence, an eternal cycle of remembrance and fear, a chorus of names lost to time but never forgotten by the thing that waits, patient and certain, for the next fool who believes that they can hear the truth and walk away untouched. And so the deeper truth, the one that no official record dares to speak and no passing traveler can fully escape, is that Willow Creek does not simply haunt, it harvests quietly, deliberately, and with a patience that mocks human attempts at resistance. For every cross erected, every prayer whispered, every ritual of banishment has dissolved like smoke in the night, leaving only the undeniable fact that those who come too close vanish not by accident but by design, as if they were marked long before their boots touched the soil. Generations whisper about lights flickering in windows of houses with no owners, about voices calling from the woods in the exact tones of loved ones long dead, about the way the water in the creek runs clear by day but black as tar under moonlight, reflecting faces that are not your own. These are not stories of madness. They are warnings encoded in folklore, desperate attempts to tell the living what the dead already know. Willow Creek does not forget, it does not forgive, and it does not release. Every missing child, every wandering soul, every family that left without packing their belongings is woven into the fabric of this place, their essence fueling whatever ancient covenant holds the land in its grip. And the most unsettling part, the one that keeps even the boldest men from boasting too loudly, is the suspicion that the creek is not just taking, but transforming, folding its victims into something other, something that waits in the tree line with eyes too human to be animal and too cold to be human, watching, remembering, and waiting for the next story to begin exactly as the last one ended, with someone believing they can stare into its darkness and still walk away whole. The horror of Willow Creek, then, is not only in the things that are seen or the disappearances that can be counted, but in the suffocating sense that the entire land is a machine of memory, that the soil itself is a ledger where the names of the lost are written in roots and stone, and that the deeper you breathe its air, the more you are written into that same unbroken text, a living entry awaiting your end. Those who dared to map its boundaries found their compasses spinning wild, their instruments useless, as though the land refused to be measured by human hands. Those who tried to settle and build lives spoke of waking at night to find the ground beneath their homes pulsing like the skin of a buried animal, their walls humming with a low sound that was not wind, not insects, but something deliberate, a calling. And when they left, as so many eventually did, they carried the infection with them, not disease of flesh, but an erosion of will, a voice in the back of the skull reminding them in the quietest hours that they were still being watched, that their leaving had only been tolerated, not permitted. That is why Willow Creek endures not as legend alone, but as contagion, a place that reaches far beyond its physical limits, planting its shadow in anyone who dares acknowledge it, drawing them back with a magnetic cruelty. And when the return comes, because it always does, the creek closes its ledger with a precision that feels less like nature and more like law. And in that closing, it adds one more soul to its library of silence. It is this law, silent and inescapable, that has given rise to whispers among historians, occultists, and wanderers alike, that Willow Creek is not merely haunted, but governed, as though some hidden tribunal sits beneath its waters, issuing verdicts on all who trespass, and what seems like randomness in its tragedies is in fact an order too vast and too old for us to recognize. Cattle torn apart in patterns that resemble ritual rather than hunger, trees split down the middle as if by lightning. Though the skies were clear, children found staring into the current with eyes so wide and unblinking they seemed less alive than conscripted, their mouths whispering names no family could trace, as though they were reciting from that invisible ledger. The deeper one studies, the more impossible it becomes to dismiss as folklore, for the accounts across decades echo each other with uncanny symmetry. The same reports of a low hum that rattles the bones, the same description of figures half glimpsed at the tree line, not rushing nor fleeing but waiting, patient as predators who know that time itself is their weapon. And the scholars who tried to catalog it all rarely survived unscathed. Manuscripts abruptly unfinished, notes descending into incoherence, sketches of symbols that seem to fold back upon themselves like mirrors in mirrors, a collapse of meaning that suggests the very act of observation feeds the phenomenon, strengthens it, extends its reach. Which is why those who still dare to walk its edges do not ask whether they will see something, but whether they will be permitted to leave unchanged. For Willow Creek does not merely devour, it rewrites. The strangest thing, perhaps, is that Willow Creek seems to possess a selective intelligence, a kind of cold discretion that decides who may carry its story forward and who must be silenced. Those who mock it, who enter its woods with bravado and laughter, are often found with mouths stretched wide in a rictus of terror, their bodies contorted as though they had glimpsed something vast and indescribable, while others, often the quiet ones, the broken ones, are spared, not unharmed, but transformed, emerging with words not their own, speaking in cadences older than any tongue, warning of balances to be kept and debts long unpaid, as if the creek itself has chosen them as unwilling messengers. Over generations, families who lived near its banks began to show peculiar traits: a tendency towards sudden disappearances, dreams of drowning that spanned entire bloodlines, and an inability to speak of certain nights without breaking into uncontrollable weeping. Even the landscape reflects its dominion, for the earth around the creek never quite settles. Stones rearrange themselves after storms. Paths shift subtly so that travelers swear they are walking in circles, and structures, cabins, barns, even fences, rot faster there than anywhere else, as though time itself runs uneven, chewing away at wood and flesh alike. And yet, despite every warning, despite every name etched into the faded cemetery stones nearby, there is always someone drawn to it. Historians chasing whispers, wanderers seeking answers, or broken souls searching for an end. And it is in this endless cycle of curiosity and consumption that Willow Creek reveals its truest nature, not as a place, but as a hunger wearing the mask of water and trees, patient enough to outlast generations, cunning enough to erase its own witnesses, and merciless enough to ensure that what began as legend will always remain half-forgotten truth, a secret too poisonous to carry and too powerful to bury. And so the question that festers beneath every telling is not whether Willow Creek is haunted, cursed, or damned, but whether it is alive, whether the water itself is a sentient parasite that has learned to root itself in human history, the way ivy clings to stone, feeding not on flesh alone, but on memory, on fear, on silence. For each generation that tries to suppress its stories unwittingly nourishes it, giving it the power of absence, the power of unspoken terror, until its reach becomes invisible yet undeniable, stretching into the decisions of townsfolk who avoid the subject, the way children instinctively refuse to play near its edge, or how maps gradually omit its existence as though the land itself conspires in its concealment. To step near it is to feel time bend, not in obvious ways, but in subtle fractures, the rustle of leaves that seem to echo seconds after they should, the sight of your own footprints behind you as though you've been circling without moving forward, the uncanny certainty that something ancient and watching lurks just beyond the shimmer of water. Survivors describe it as a threshold, more than a place, a door that never fully opens but always threatens to, and those who vanish are not mourned so much as resigned to, as if the town itself has accepted that Willow Creek takes what it requires, demanding a toll for being ignored. This is why no revival, no celebration of history, no attempt to tame or honor it has ever endured. The few who tried to build shrines or to sanctify its banks with prayer and ritual were rewarded with greater horrors. Their voices found babbling in tongues no man could decipher, their faces aged decades overnight, their shadows bending in directions that betrayed the laws of sun and moon. The creek endures because it is not bound to one form, one story, one moment. It is a current in the unseen river that runs beneath a poi, human fear, and those who seek to master it find instead that they have been mastered, their names lost, their bloodlines corrupted, their histories absorbed into the endless silence of water that flows yet never moves. And perhaps the most chilling truth is that Willow Creek does not require belief to function, for disbelief serves it just as well. Skepticism, laughter, dismissal, all of these are invitations in disguise because they lower the guard of the one who approaches, tricking him into thinking the danger is only in stories, that the dread is only in the imagination, until the moment he leans too close and the air seems to pulse with a heartbeat not his own, and the reflection in the water is no longer his face, but a face slightly altered, slightly hungrier, slightly older, as though the creek is showing him what he will become when it has finished with him. It is not a place that kills in a frenzy, like some beast, but one that lures, reshapes, consumes in increments so slowly that even those who live under its shadow may not notice the corruption until it has spread too far to reverse. A father who speaks less each season until silence becomes his only language. A mother whose hands are found raw from scrubbing at dirt that will not leave her skin. children who hum strange melodies with no known origin, as though they were born remembering something they should not. The town learned long ago not to confront this directly, because confrontation only deepens its grip. Instead, they bury it in silence, in false normalcy, convincing themselves they can live alongside it as one lives beside weather, inevitable and untamable. Yet the record of vanishing families, of houses abandoned without explanation, of journals ending mid-sentence, proves that no bargain has ever been kept, no truce has ever been honored. The creek is not patient in the way men are. It is eternal, a presence that waits without moving, a parasite that knows it cannot be starved because it feeds on time itself. On the way, fear stretches minutes into eternities and swallows whole generations into forgetting, and those who leave are never truly free. They carry its silence with them, and in their children's dreams the sound of water returns, calling them back, reminding them that escape is only another form of delay, and that one day the river that runs under all rivers will rise to claim what belongs to it. And so Willow Creek becomes less a place on a map than a condition of the soul, a lingering infection that stains every life it touches, ensuring that no account is ever complete and no testimony is ever reliable, because even memory bends to its current, twisting recollection into contradiction, leaving survivors unsure whether they lived through a nightmare or merely dreamt one, though the scars on their bodies and the holes in their families insist it was real. The deeper horror is not just that the creek takes, but that it rewrites, altering the framework of reality so subtly that by the time someone notices, they no longer remember what it was supposed to be, like a man who forgets his own name while swearing he has never had one, or a child who insists she has always been alone, though her mother still stands beside her weeping. It is this erosion of certainty, this gnawing of foundations, that makes Willow Creek more dangerous than any monster that could be faced and slain. For how do you fight a thing that erases the very idea of resistance, a thing that convinces you surrender was always your choice? The landscape conspires in its silence, trees leaning closer as though listening, stones that shift when no one watches, a mist that hangs unnaturally low as if pressing down on lungs, and every step toward the water is a step into another order of being, one where time, identity, and memory collapse into the hunger of the current. And perhaps that is the final revelation, the one hidden in the whisper of reeds and the glint of moonlight on black water. That Willow Creek is not waiting to consume the world, because it already has, and the rest of us are merely the remnants, walking through an illusion of continuity, while beneath us the river flows, patient and endless, dragging us all toward a mouth we cannot see. Which is why those who return from its banks rarely speak, not out of choice, but because speech itself falters in the presence of what they have seen, words breaking apart like rotten wood under weight. For language is built upon shared reality, and Willow Creek shatters that foundation, leaving only fragments of experience too jagged to hold. So when survivors try to recount their nights in the valley, they choke on half-formed syllables, their voices shaking with meanings that never resolve, as though the current itself flows through their tongues, pulling coherence back into its depths. And even in silence, their eyes betray them, glazed with a haunted glaze that no doctor can cure, as if something inside them still listens to the river's eternal call. Neighbors speak of their sudden absences, the way they rise from bed in the middle of the night, barefoot and blank-faced, walking straight toward the fog, not resisting when pulled back, not crying out when bound to their own homes for safety, only staring past loved ones with a devotion that borders on worship, and when asked what lies at the heart of that water, they only whisper one word no one remembers afterward, because memory itself refuses to hold it, as though the creek has already claimed it for its own. And this, more than the missing bodies, more than the drowned livestock, more than the vanished children, is what finally breaks a community. The realization that what seeps from the creek is not just death, but a contagion of forgetting, a sickness of certainty, a quiet unraveling of reality that infects the mind before it takes the flesh, leaving the living as hollow as the drowned, waiting only for the day when the current comes to collect what it already owns. And so the elders, who once swore never to speak its name, gathered in hushed council inside the decaying church that leaned against the hillside, its bell long fallen silent. And there they confessed to one another the truth that had been hidden for generations. That the creek was not born of rain nor mountain spring, but of something older, something buried beneath the earth when men first carved their homes into the valley, a wound in the land that bled water instead of fire, and that wound had never healed, only widened, drawing down into itself not only bodies, but memories, promises, and time itself. They spoke of how their fathers and grandfathers had built their houses with their backs turned to the water, never daring to face it directly. How the first maps of Willow Creek left it unmarked, as though cartographers themselves refused to give it permanence, and how each family was charged with the same duty, to teach their children to fear, but not to ask, to obey, but not to know, because knowing was the key, and the creek wanted nothing more than for someone to name what lived beneath its surface, for naming is an invitation. An invitation is permission, and so long as it remained nameless, it remained chained, bound to its banks though not harmless. And that night, as the oil lamps flickered and the walls seemed to sweat with a dampness that had no source, they realized too late that their gathering, their very act of remembering aloud, was itself a summoning, for the air grew heavy, the floor trembled with a hollow groan, and through the broken church door they could already hear it, the slow and steady rush of water, though the creek lay miles away, as if the current itself had risen to meet them, answering their words with the sound of arrival. The youngest of the elders, a man whose eyes still carried the restless fire of someone who had not yet been broken by age, rose to his feet and demanded why they had been made to carry this curse in silence, why entire generations had been sacrificed to fear and secrecy, while the thing in the creek grew stronger in shadows, and his voice cracked with the weight of desperation, for his own daughter had been among the most recent taken, swallowed without a ripple, as though the water had been waiting for her alone, and the others, gray and weary, told him there had once been a chance to end it, back when the first stones of Willow Creek were laid, but the founders had bargained instead, choosing prosperity over purity, making a pact that was never written but always kept, a pact that promised thriving harvests, healthy cattle, and children born strong in exchange for silence, obedience, and the occasional life the water demanded. Yet now the pact was unraveling, the offerings no longer sufficed, and the creek had begun to choose freely whom it wanted, not merely the weak or the wandering, but the beloved, the innocent, the anchors of each family. And as the young man's fists clenched against the rotting wood of the pews, the elders lowered their heads, ashamed and afraid, for in that moment the truth settled over them like the chill of grave soil, that it was not the water alone that cursed Willow Creek, but the cowardice of men who long ago chose survival over defiance, and now the price had grown too steep for anyone to bear, and outside, in the distance, the sound of the water grew louder, closer, as though the creek itself was moving, flowing uphill toward the church, hungry for the names that had finally been spoken aloud. The doors of the church trembled on their hinges as though pressed by a storm, though the night outside was still, and the candles along the altar guttered violently, casting shadows that stretched and twisted across the wooden walls, making it seem as if the very boards themselves were bending under a great pressure, and the elders, those worn custodians of silence, began to mutter prayers that had no words, only broken fragments of an older tongue that none of the younger men understood. While the young father, who had risen in defiance, staggered forward, refusing to kneel, his breath quickening as he shouted that no pact could bind his blood, no ancient bargain could swallow his child without him ripping it apart with his own hands, and yet even as he spoke, his voice was drowned out by the sound of rushing water, that was not rushing at all, but flowing in steady, deliberate rhythm, like the measured pulse of something alive. And when the doors finally burst open, It was not rain or flood that poured into the church, but a black film of water, shallow at first, but alive, rippling against the grain of the floorboards, rising with purpose, carrying with it the scent of earth freshly unearthed, of graves opened in the night, and the congregation gasped as the water seemed to stop at each pew, curling like fingers around the legs of benches and then receding, as if it were choosing, selecting, deciding who among them it would take. And in that moment the young man understood what the elders had tried to bury. The creek was not cursed ground, but a mouth, an old mouth carved into the earth, and every life given had been a feeding, a sustaining. And now it had grown hungry beyond appeasement. And though the others recoiled, he waded forward into the black water, screaming his daughter's name, daring the thing to answer. And somewhere beneath the sound of splashing, beneath too, a chorus of panicked prayers, a voice rose from the depths, a voice that was not spoken but breathed directly into the marrow of every bone, saying simply, "The blood remembers." The young father froze as the voice wrapped itself around his spine like a serpent, its echo not carried by air but stitched into the very fibers of his being, and with every repetition of those 3 words, "The blood remembers," he felt his knees weaken, not from fear but from the undeniable recognition that this was not some outside force intruding upon his world, but something bred into him, something older than his family name, older than the town, older than the creek itself, as though his ancestors had poured their secrets into his veins and left him as an unwilling vessel of continuity, and the water, now up to his waist, pressed against him with a strange warmth, not the cold bite of floodwaters, but the cloying embrace of a womb, pulling him inward while the elders began to chant louder, their voices trembling as they spoke the forbidden syllables they had kept locked away for decades. But their prayer cracked in half when one of them, the oldest of them all, collapsed forward and pressed his face into the water, willingly offering himself like a key turning in a lock. And instantly the church shuddered, the wooden beams groaning as if they were the ribs of some enormous beast. And in that chaos, the young father realized his fight was not against the elders or even the water, but against the lineage that had already chosen his child, because the hunger that lived beneath the creek was not a curse upon the town. It was the town. It was the secret spine holding everything upright, the unspoken pact that had allowed generations to prosper while burying their shame in baptisms of sacrifice. And now it demanded payment in full, not a token, not a single lamb, but blood that carried the memory. And as he screamed again for his daughter, the water rose higher, dragging him down to his chest, his throat, his mouth, until every breath was stolen and his final thought before. The blackness closed over his head was not of escape, but of recognition, a horrific clarity that he had never stood a chance because his defiance, his rage, his willingness to confront it all, that too was memory, inherited rebellion scripted into the blood, and the creek had only been waiting for him to play his part. When he awoke, it was not with the relief of air filling his lungs, but with the crushing heaviness of silence, for there was no water, no elders, no church, only an endless gray plain stretching outward in every direction, as though the world had been stripped of color and sound. And yet in that desolation he heard the familiar voice again, not as a whisper this time, but as a chorus layered thick with generations, men and women, children and the dying, all speaking through him, each syllable tearing a seam wider in his chest, until he realized he was not standing on ground at all, but on memory itself, a woven floor of countless lives whose tragedies had been consumed by the same force he now stood before. And from the horizon rose a figure that was not man, not beast, but a convergence of shapes, the bent spines of ancestors, the shadowed silhouettes of drowned children, the flaring outlines of rituals performed by candlelight, and at its center a face that was both his own and not his own, a reflection stretched across centuries, smiling with the quiet cruelty of inevitability. And as he reached for the only thought that mattered, his daughter, the figure shifted and revealed her standing beside it, untouched, calm, but with eyes that had gone black as coal, eyes that no longer searched for him but looked through him, as if she now carried the weight of every secret the creek had ever swallowed. And in that moment he understood the true horror. She had not been taken, she had been chosen, and worse still, she had accepted, not with fear, but with the ease of something remembering itself. And when she spoke, it was not her voice, but his mother's and his grandfather's, and all those before him, speaking in unison. You fought, and still you served, and the figure reached out its hand, not to him, but to her. And together they began to walk into the gray, leaving him stranded in the vast nothing, a witness to his own bloodline sealing itself deeper into bondage, and the silence that followed was more unbearable than any drowning, because it was the silence of erasure, the kind that eats away the memory of resistance, until even the scream you once carried belongs no longer to you, but to the thing that fed on it.